with the hesitation, allowing Jose Canseco to score, and he fails to get Dave Parker at second base, so the Oakland A's take.
I'll tell you what, we're having an
October 17th, 1989. 4 minutes past 5 in the evening at Candlestick Park, San Francisco. 62,000 people are in the stands. Game 3 of the World Series, Oakland against San Francisco, the Bay against the Bay, starts in half an hour. Across Northern California, the freeways are strangely, mercifully empty. Half the region left work early to be near a television. On ABC, the pregame show is 4 minutes old. The screen goes dark for 60 million Americans, mid-word. 15 seconds of shaking. That's all this earthquake will need. When the pictures come back, they will show a 2-story freeway lying on itself in Oakland, a San Francisco neighborhood on fire, a piece of the Bay Bridge missing, and a country watching, live, the first major earthquake in its history to interrupt its own broadcast. 63 people are about to die. And here is the part of this story that no one in that stadium knows yet. The 2 places about to kill the most people tonight were both, in a documented, on-paper sense, foretold. A freeway that engineers had been warned about for 18 years, and a neighborhood built deliberately on the buried wreckage of the last great earthquake. San Francisco had entombed the rubble of 1906, built homes on top of it, and forgotten. Tonight, 1906 reaches forward 83 years and touches a match to it. This is the story of the 15 seconds America watched live and the 2 warnings it had filed away. The earthquake had, in fact, sent a save the date. 60 miles south, 11 miles underground, a locked section of the San Andreas, roughly 25 miles of it, reaches the end of 83 years of patience. At 5:04 and 15 seconds, it lets go. This is the kind of story this channel exists for. It was not a secret. It was a government document. Like most government documents, it changed very little about how anyone lived. What made the warning so easy to file away was the region's own memory, or rather, the lack of it. After 1906, the Bay Area entered one of the strangest periods in its geological history, more than 8 decades of deep seismic quiet. Generations grew up, built, and grew old in San Francisco without ever experiencing a destructive earthquake. The quiet wasn't safety. It was the fault holding its breath, the strain of the Pacific Plate's steady creep accumulating in locked rock, decade after decade, precisely because nothing was moving. Seismologists understood this perfectly. The public experienced the opposite lesson. 83 years of evidence that earthquakes were something that happened to grandparents, and the mountain itself had knocked twice. In June of 1988, and again in August of 1989, 10 weeks before this night, moderate earthquakes shook the ridge near Lake Elsman in these same mountains on this same fault system. They rattled windows, made the news, and passed. But at the Geological Survey, they were read differently, as possible foreshocks. After the August event, scientists took a step that was, for its era, remarkable. They issued a short-term public advisory that a larger earthquake on this segment was possible in the coming days. The days passed. Nothing came. The advisory expired, life resumed, and the 2 knocks joined the 1988 study in the same drawer. In hindsight, the sequence reads like a countdown. In real time, it read like California. So, on October 17th, the Bay Area was doing the most Bay Area thing imaginable, throwing a party on top of a loaded fault. The World Series had, for the first time, matched the region's 2 teams against each other, an event so consuming that rush hour simply failed to happen. Offices emptied at 4. Bars filled. Highway 880 through West Oakland, normally bumper to bumper at 5 p.m., carried a fraction of its usual load. Remember that half-empty freeway. It is about to become the single luckiest accident of the night. At Candlestick, the crowd is settling in. On the ABC broadcast, Tim McCarver is narrating highlights from Game 2.
The Game 3, it's been dominant Oakland pitching, of course, in the first 2 games, so Roger Craig has made some changes in the Giants lineup. Ken Oberkfell, the great pinch hitter, will...
Beneath the Santa Cruz Mountains, 60 miles south of San Francisco, runs the San Andreas Fault, the grinding boundary where the Pacific Plate slides past North America. Not diving under it, sliding along it sideways, a few inches a year, with sections locking up for decades, and then paying off the accumulated motion all at once. The section under those mountains had been locked since 1906, and just 1 year before this night, in 1988, federal scientists had published a formal probability study naming this exact segment as one of the most likely stretches of the entire fault to rupture in the coming decades. Find the disaster told properly. If that's why you're here, subscribe, and the next one finds you. What happens next travels outward at more than 7,000 miles per hour. That is not an artist's animation. It is the United States Geological Survey's own computed reconstruction of this earthquake. The shaking radiating from the Santa Cruz Mountains like rings from a stone. Watch the timing. The mountains in Santa Cruz get hit first and hardest. Then the pulse races north. And here the Bay Area's deep geology takes over because the rings do not weaken evenly. Where the ground is old, hard rock, the shaking passes through and moves on. Where the ground is young, soft, waterlogged, bay mud, river sediment, and above all, artificial fill. The waves slow down, stack up, and amplify. Soft ground doesn't dampen an earthquake. It turns the volume up. Keep that rule. The whole night runs on it. Pause on the profile of this earthquake because it explains the whole strange geography of the damage. Magnitude 6.9 is not, by global standards, a giant. The planet produces one most months. What made this one lethal was placement, shallow enough that its energy reached the surface, still concentrated, and positioned so that its strongest release pointed up the peninsula along the very corridor where 7 million people lived. An earthquake's death toll is almost never a function of its magnitude alone. It is magnitude multiplied by proximity, multiplied by ground, multiplied by what humans chose to build on that ground. Loma Prieta scored modestly on the first factor and catastrophically on the last 2. 15 seconds was all it had. 15 seconds was enough because the targets had been standing ready for decades. In the stadium, concrete on solid ground, it arrives as a rolling shutter. Players grab their families. A cameraman's feed whips sideways. The crowd, wonderfully and absurdly, cheers. The stadium PA plays "We Will Rock You," and for a few minutes, 62,000 people believe they've just shared a great California story. Candlestick itself, it turned out, had been part of the story. The stadium, a concrete bowl from 1960, holding 62,000 people over a fault-laced peninsula, cracked. Chunks of concrete loosened in the upper deck. Expansion joints ground visibly against each other as the structure swayed through the shaking it had been designed, decades earlier, to survive. It held, but the cheerful minutes after, the crowd chanting, families on the field, were happening inside a building that engineers would spend that night inspecting. And the decision to postpone was made partly because no one could yet certify the bowl those 62,000 people were standing in. The luckiest broadcast interruption in television history was also 62,000 people discovering, in good spirits, that they had just ridden out a magnitude 6.9 inside a 30-year-old concrete ring. In the newsrooms, it arrives as a live event with the cameras already hot, anchors gripping desks, lights swinging. And then, within minutes, broadcasters doing something television had never really done before, covering a great earthquake from inside it in real time, with no information beyond what was shaking around them. For the first hour, nobody on air knows what you now know. The reports arrive one at a time, each worse than the last, and two of them are about to define the night. The worst news comes from West Oakland, and to understand it, you have to go back to 1957, when the Cypress Street Viaduct, a 1.25 miles of double-decked freeway, 2 layers of traffic stacked on concrete frames, an engineering showpiece of its era. Its era is the problem. Cypress was built from what engineers now call non-ductile concrete, columns with too little steel reinforcement, joints that cannot bend. Concrete like that is strong until the moment it isn't. It doesn't sway and recover, it cracks, and then it lets go of everything at once. And here is the institutional heart of this story. Everyone responsible had known for 18 years. In 1971, the San Fernando earthquake near Los Angeles snapped freeway structures of this same generation, and the lesson was written into reports, budgets, and retrofit programs. California's non-ductile elevated freeways were a documented seismic hazard. The Cypress received a partial fix, cable restrainers to keep deck sections from sliding apart. The columns themselves, the actual weakness, were scheduled deeper in the program. The fix for what would actually fail was, in October 1989, still in the queue. 15 seconds of shaking, amplified by the soft bay margin ground under West Oakland, found every one of those columns. The upper deck of the Cypress came down onto the lower deck along more than a mile, not toppling, pancaking, layer onto layer, with the evening's traffic between them. In West Oakland, the collapse announced itself as a sound and a cloud. Residents describe a rolling series of concussions, the decks meeting, span after span, in under half a minute, and then a wall of gray concrete dust boiling out from under the structure, so thick that the first people running toward it thought a plane had come down on the freeway, or that something had exploded. When the dust thinned, the geometry told the story instantly. Where 2 levels of freeway had stood against the sky, there was now, along great stretches, effectively one, the upper deck resting on the lower, with the space between them compressed, in the worst spans, to inches. 42 people died there, 2/3 of the night's entire toll on one structure. And on any normal Tuesday at 5:04 p.m., that number would have been several times larger. The freeway was carrying World Series traffic, a fraction of its usual load. The disaster that defined the earthquake was, simultaneously, the disaster the earthquake mostly missed. What happened next is the part the Bay Area still tells with pride. The first rescuers on the Cypress were not agencies. They were West Oakland, the neighborhood the freeway had been built on top of. Residents came out of their houses with extension ladders, ropes, and pickup trucks. Workers from a nearby plant drove heavy equipment straight to the structure. People climbed onto a cracked, aftershock-rattled double-decker freeway and began pulling strangers out of the gap between its layers. Nurses and firefighters crawled into spaces 2 feet high between decks that every aftershock threatened to close. The professionals arrived into a rescue already running. Firefighters brought ladder trucks alongside the ladders from garages, Crane operators volunteered their machines, and medical teams did something the textbooks did not cover. Surgeons and paramedics went into the structure, crawling flat between the decks with flashlights, treating trapped drivers where they lay. In gaps, a handspan tall, while the concrete above them shifted with every aftershock. Ask Bay Area Emergency Services where their modern urban search and rescue doctrine comes from. And the Cypress is the answer. The night, improvised procedures that became the manual. And into that gap between decks, science climbed too, in a form that had never been used before. USGS scientists rigged a prototype, sensors on the fault's aftershock zone, radio links to the rescue site, a warning horn that gave crews seconds to scramble clear before each aftershock's waves arrived. It was improvised, analog, and it worked. The first operational earthquake early warning in American history. Born on the deck of the disaster it was protecting people from. Hold that thought until the end of this story. For 4 days, the structure gave back the dead, and the men working it stopped expecting anything else. A Caltrans engineer named Gary Whipple was there in exactly that capacity. His job, as he later described it, was to assess and secure the structure so that body recovery could continue. Asked years afterward whether he had given up hope of finding anyone alive by then, his answer was simply yes. 89 hours after the earthquake, he found Buck Helms, a 57-year-old dock worker, alive, in a car crushed to a height of about 3 feet. A city that had spent 4 days counting in one direction got, for one morning, to count in the other. If you're still here, you're exactly who this channel is built for. Subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it's the whole reason these keep getting made. Across the bay, San Francisco's most elegant waterfront neighborhood was discovering what it was standing on. The Marina District, pastel row houses, bay views, one of the most desirable addresses in the city, sits on land that did not exist in 1905. After the 1906 earthquake and fire destroyed San Francisco, the city faced a mountain of rubble and a shallow lagoon on its northern shore. It solved both problems with one decision. The wreckage of the ruined city, brick, timber, ash, debris, went into the water as fill, topped with sand dredged from the bay. And by 1915, the new land was hosting a World's Fair, celebrating the city's rebirth. Then they built houses on it. San Francisco buried its last great earthquake, landscaped it, and sold it in lots. Soft, water-saturated, man-made ground, the exact material the Shake movie rule flagged. When the 1989 waves arrived, the fill did what loose, wet fill does under sustained shaking. The water between the grains took over, and the ground briefly stopped being solid. Buildings designed to stand on land found themselves standing on something closer to a liquid. Corners of apartment blocks dropped. First stories, many of them soft, garage-fronted frames, folded, setting third floors down at street level onto the cars parked below. USGS photographs from the next morning show it plainly, a building kneeling in the street, on ground that had been advertised as Bay View Real Estate for 70 years. The Marina's houses had a second vulnerability stacked on the first, and it has a name worth knowing because California is still fixing it. The soft story. The neighborhood's elegant flats were typically built over street-level garages, wide door openings, minimal walls, an entire building's weight carried on a first floor that was mostly holes. On firm ground, fine. On liquefying fill, the flexible ground and the flexible first floor found each other. The garage level racked sideways and folded, and the rigid upper floors rode down on top of it, intact. That is why the morning after photographs look so surreal. Third stories at street level, roofs nearly undamaged, the crushed cars in what used to be garages. The buildings didn't crumble, they knelt. And in one of those kneeling buildings, at Devastation and Beach, there was a woman under the rubble. Her name was Shara Cox.
Kept saying, "Where's Jerry?" Because I have to have his last name. And so he said, "Why you want his last name?" And I said, "I have to thank him." And people laughed, but I said, "No, I'm not leaving here till you get me to get Jerry's last name."
She was 56 years old, an office manager, and she was home early that evening for the same reason half the Bay Area was, to watch the World Series. When the ground moved, 2 floors came down on top of her and pinned her with a crushed hip and pelvis. Firefighters from 3 different companies worked that building. Captain Bob Boo Dures and firefighter Jim Jenkins found a crawl space running 25 feet into the rubble and went in, then were driven back out by escaping gas. They shut off the valves and went in again, and were driven out a second time because the building across the street was now burning, and there was not yet enough water to hold it off. Only when a hose line could protect them did they go back a third time, joined now by Jerry Shannon and Duke Police. At the end of that crawl space, flat on his back with about 2 feet of clearance, Shannon made voice contact.
Can you hear me? Hello?
I'm here!
She could hear him. He told her he had to go back out for a saw.
Okay, I'm gonna have to go back and get a chainsaw. If you keep talking, I'll crawl to where your voice is.
And she would not let go of his hand. So he promised her he would come back. Then 4 men spent 2.5 hours cutting 5 feet of collapsed building apart from the inside, burning through 2 chainsaws, working with bolt cutters and axes, while the fire advanced across the street, and crews on the roof held a water curtain against it and called down time checks. People outside told them the situation was hopeless and to get out before the rest of the building came down on them. They stayed. When the blade came within inches of her face, Shannon took off his turnout coat and put it over her head to keep the splinters out of her eyes. Then they pulled her free, and she refused to get into the ambulance until somebody told her the name of the man who had come back.
So I went up and I told her my name, and she goes, "You're my hero." At that point, they put her in the ambulance and closed the door, and they wheeled her away. Away she went, and we went back to work.
Shara Cox never walked unaided again. She and Jerry Shannon remained close for the rest of her life. He was with her almost every day in her final weeks. That is the Marina District's night in one address, a neighborhood built on the buried rubble of 1906, standing on ground that turned to liquid, with 4 men on their stomachs inside it, refusing to leave. Then came the fire, because the same ground that failed the buildings failed the pipes inside it. Gas mains cracked and fed flames. Water mains cracked and starved the hydrants.
The block after and hooking up, opening the hydrants, nothing. And there was just no water to be had. All the mains were broken.
A neighborhood was burning in front of live news helicopters, and the fire department's hoses were connected to a broken system. The solution came from 1906's other lesson. The city's fireboat, the Phoenix, pumped seawater from the bay itself, relayed inland through hoses stretched block after block. While Marina residents, hundreds of them, formed lines to help firefighters drag hose and evacuate the elderly. The fire was stopped by the ocean, pumped uphill, past houses standing on the buried ashes of the last time this exact solution had been needed. There is one image from the marina that survivors kept returning to, and it deserves its beat. Firefighters connecting to hydrant after hydrant and getting nothing. The most basic promise of a modern city. Water behind the valve, gone precisely when the city was burning. The system that failed and the system that saved the neighborhood were built by the same lesson 83 years apart. After 1906, San Francisco had built a special high-pressure water network and kept a fireboat exactly because earthquakes break water mains. In 1989, on ground made of 1906's rubble against a fire fed by 1989's broken gas mains, that 80-year-old insurance policy, the boat, the bay, and a neighborhood full of volunteers hauling 5-inch hose by hand is what held the line. The Marina fire stopped at one ruined block. In 1906, the same fire, unchecked, had taken the city. The night had smaller cruelties too. On the Bay Bridge, a 50-foot section of the upper deck dropped onto the lower like a trapdoor. One driver died at the gap. The bridge closed for a month. And down near the epicenter, in Santa Cruz, the old brick downtown, the Pacific Garden Mall, shed its unreinforced walls into the streets and onto 3 people. The pattern of the entire night, written 3 ways. The structures that killed were the old, the brittle, and the built-on soft. Every one of them belonging to a category engineers had already named. Here is what made Loma Prieta different from every American earthquake before it. The whole country was already watching when it happened. The people who captured what the country saw were, that evening, ordinary news photographers on an ordinary assignment. 4 of them from one station alone: Larry Warner, Sean Donahue, Kevin Raphael, Lionel Coleman, spent the night filming a city they lived in, on deadline, in the dark, and their footage is most of what survives of those hours. ABC had come for a baseball game. It had a blimp over the bay and a national audience in their seats. Within the hour, the World Series broadcast had become the first live national coverage of a great American earthquake, culpable narrating aerials of a burning neighborhood filmed from an airship hired to shoot a ballpark. Local stations, some knocked off the air, came back on generators. One broadcast from a damaged building on an emergency feed and simply kept talking to a region sitting in the dark, which is the strange intimacy of this disaster. The Bay Area experienced it largely by candlelight and battery radio, while the rest of the country watched it in color, live, from above. Those first hours also carried a fear the archive preserves in the anchor's voices, the early casualty estimates. Based on what the Cypress looked like from the air, a mile of pancaked freeway at what should have been rush hour, officials briefed and networks reported that the dead there alone might number in the hundreds. It took days of cutting into the structure to learn that the World Series had quietly emptied the freeway first, and the final toll, 63 across the entire region, 3,757 injured, 12,000 people displaced from their homes, $6 billion in damage, landed far below that first terrible arithmetic. It remains one of the clearest recorded cases of a disaster's true shape emerging in public. Live, correction by correction. The game itself surrendered. The series stopped for 10 days, the longest pause in its history. And when it resumed, Candlestick held a moment for the 63. The earthquake had killed people, closed bridges, and burned a neighborhood. It had also, by the accident of its timing, produced the best documented 15 seconds in seismic history to that point. Recorded by broadcast cameras, news helicopters, stadium film crews, and a blimp. Every frame of which now serves the purpose this channel exists for: evidence. Cypress was never rebuilt. The structure was demolished and the replacement freeway was routed around West Oakland, the neighborhood that had lived under it for 30 years, then climbed onto it with ladders. Where the double-decker stood there is now a boulevard named for Nelson Mandela. The Bay Bridge got, eventually, an entirely new eastern span, engineered against exactly the failure of 1989. Across California, the column-by-column retrofit that had been in the queue in October 1989 became one of the largest seismic engineering programs on Earth. The state's elevated freeways today are wrapped, jacketed, and reinforced substantially because of 15 seconds on the Cypress. The other two killers of the night were named and hunted as well. Unreinforced brick, the Santa Cruz downtown's material, was already illegal for new construction. After 1989, California forced the existing stock into the open, with inventories and retrofit mandates that have, city by city, been bolting the old brick to its bones ever since. And the Marina's soft stories launched what became, decades later, mandatory retrofit programs in San Francisco and beyond. The garages of tens of thousands of apartment buildings braced with steel because of what the fill did to the marina. None of it is finished. All of it is traceable to the same 15 seconds, and that improvised warning horn on the rescue deck grew up. The prototype that gave Cypress workers seconds of aftershock warning became a founding ancestor of the earthquake early warning system, now running on millions of West Coast phones. The alert designed to arrive before the shaking does. The next time a Californian's phone buzzes ahead of an earthquake, part of that lineage runs back through a pile of collapsed freeway in West Oakland, 1989. And quietly, beneath the drama, Loma Prieta handed engineering a gift no American earthquake had delivered at this scale: data. By 1989, California had spent 2 decades bolting strong motion instruments to its ground, its bridges, its buildings, and this was the first great earthquake to strike a fully instrumented modern region. Hundreds of recordings captured exactly how hard each kind of ground shook, exactly how each kind of structure responded, exactly how much the bay mud and the fill amplified the waves compared to rock a block away. The soft ground rule this story keeps returning to stopped being a principle and became a database. Modern seismic building codes, the reason a 6.9 under a U.S. city today would be a bad day rather than a mass casualty event, are written page after page in numbers this earthquake produced. One correction the cameras themselves needed. The blimps and helicopters were all pointed at San Francisco and Oakland, but the earthquake's home was 60 miles south, and the towns nearest the epicenter carried damage the national broadcast barely met. Santa Cruz lost its historic downtown for years, not days. In Watsonville, a farming town of modest means, hundreds of homes and an old church came off their foundations, and families slept in parks and cars long after the networks had gone home. Every televised disaster has an off-camera version, poorer and closer to the fault. Loma Prieta belongs to those towns. This series exists partly for exactly that footnote, but the file on the Bay Area does not close, and this is the honest ending. For all its damage was not the big one. It was a magnitude 6.9, 60 miles from the city, and it killed 63 people, mostly through 2 known, named, documented weaknesses. The faults that run through the metropolitan Bay Area, under the East Bay's neighborhoods, directly beneath towns, have been accumulating strain through every year since. The 1988 probability study that correctly flagged the Santa Cruz Mountains has descendants, and their maps put the odds of a larger, closer earthquake in the coming decades not as a possibility, but as an expectation. The Bay Area rebuilt brilliantly after 1989. What it has never been able to do is unload the ground it stands on. 15 seconds, 60 miles away, on a lucky evening with empty freeways. That was 6.9. The question the region lives with, the question this whole series keeps arriving at, is written in the arithmetic of that sentence. What the full San Andreas is capable of, the earthquake, the 1989 rupture was only a fragment of, is a story we've already told. Subscribe, and the big one is waiting for you right now.